I always considered myself a lucky man. My life was simple, yet perfect. I had a wife whom I loved with all my heart. She was my friend, my partner, my universe. Together, we created a cozy home in the suburbs, where every detail reminded us of our shared happiness. Every morning, I woke up next to her and thought, I am truly a happy man. My home was filled with warmth and laughter. We spent our evenings together cooking dinner, watching movies, and discussing everything under the sun. Her smile always eased my stress, and I felt like the happiest man alive whenever I saw her by my side. She was my world, and I couldn't imagine life without her. Family had always been sacred to me. We supported each other in everything. In our family, it was customary to gather together for holidays and dinners, and these moments were special. One of the key figures in these gatherings was my uncle. You know, there are people who always bring laughter and energy with them. That was him. My uncle was the life of any gathering. He always had a funny story, an interesting thought, or a sharp joke to share. He could lift the mood even on the gloomiest day. When he came to visit, the house filled with his laughter, and everyone forgot their troubles. Honestly, I admired him. He was someone who always found the right words to offer support and never abandoned his loved ones. He and my wife quickly found common ground. It was easy for them to communicate, and I was happy that they got along so well. We were all one big family, where everyone trusted and supported each other in any situation. I remember one festive dinner when my uncle told a story about his adventures, and my wife laughed so hard she couldn't stop. Her laughter was so infectious that everyone at the table began laughing along with her. At that moment, I thought, how lucky I am. I don't just have a wife and family. I have everything. I even joked that my uncle had become the third member of our little team. He helped us with home repairs, gave advice when we needed it, and always found time to stop by. We often spent time together as a trio, and it seemed perfectly normal to me. I never thought anything could go wrong. But as they say, the biggest storms come when you least expect them. My life seemed so perfect that I didn't even notice the cracks beginning to appear. Everything seemed harmonious until one day that harmony began to crumble. Looking back now, I realized that the first signs were always there. But I was blind. I believed so strongly in my perfect picture of life that I simply refused to see how everything was slowly falling apart. At first, nothing seemed unusual. My uncle had always been part of our family, and his frequent visits to our home didn't seem strange to me. Initially, it was even touching. He would come over to help with small household chores, fix the faucet, or set up the TV. He never came empty-handed. He'd bring a bottle of wine or some dessert. I thought he was just trying to be a good relative. But over time, his visits became more frequent. At first, it was a few times a month. Then it was every week. And soon, he would appear on any given day, often without warning. He'd come in with a smile, crack a few jokes, and the house would immediately fill with his energy. I noticed how my wife lit up every time he visited. Her eyes sparkled, and she would rush to make tea or coffee for our guest. I had never been a jealous husband. I always believed that the love between my wife and me was so strong that no external factors could shake it. But over time, I began noticing things that made me uneasy. These were small details that had previously escaped my attention. My uncle was always a master at telling jokes. His stories were always funny, and I often laughed until I cried. But now, when he told stories, I noticed how my wife listened to him with such attentiveness as if every word he said was golden. She laughed louder than usual. Her eyes lit up when he looked at her. It was a different kind of laughter, not the one I was used to hearing at home. There was something too warm in it. I started noticing other things too. When my uncle joked, they exchanged glances. These glances were brief, but too intense for my taste. It began to seem a bit strange to me. But I quickly pushed those thoughts aside, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. They just get along well, I told myself. There's no reason to suspect anything. But the little things kept piling up. One day, when I came home from work early, I found them talking in the kitchen. They were sitting at the table, laughing like old friends. When I walked in, they both went quiet for a moment. Then my uncle, as always, got up to greet me with a smile on his face. But I noticed how she quickly dropped her eyes to the table, as if trying to hide something. Another time, I found her phone on the couch. The screen was locked, but I noticed that her last contact in the messenger was my uncle. They're probably discussing something about the family, I thought then. But even that thought couldn't fully calm me. Day by day, I felt that something in my world was changing. Something subtle but significant. Their shared laughter, their jokes, and those mysterious glances started to feel like warning bells. But what could I say? I was afraid of looking paranoid. After all, this was my uncle, someone I had always trusted. But inside me, a strange feeling started to grow. What if I was wrong? Or worse, what if I wasn't? Our home always felt light and carefree. We could talk for hours about anything, laugh at silly jokes, or simply sit in silence together. But suddenly, I started noticing that something had changed. It began with small things I initially tried to ignore. My wife became more distant. Her attention, which was once focused on us and our family, now seemed to drift somewhere else. For example, her phone, which usually lay on the table or in another room, was now always by her side. She carried it with her constantly, sometimes even in the pocket of her apron while cooking. It was unusual, as she had never been so attached to her phone before. If it rang or she got a message, she used to read it in front of me, sometimes laughing at funny conversations. But now things were different. When her phone rang, she'd pick it up and leave the room. One day, I asked her, "Who was that?" She responded with the usual phrase, "Oh, just a friend." But her tone was different. There was something nervous about it, as if she was in a hurry to move on from the topic. I didn't press her, but the exchange left an unpleasant feeling. Why was she suddenly avoiding such simple conversations? One evening, I came home early from work. She was sitting on the couch with her phone in her hand, smiling at the screen. When I entered, she quickly turned off the phone and placed it on the table. I noticed how she nervously straightened up and said, "Oh, you're home already? How was your day?" Her voice was overly cheerful, almost as if she was trying to hide something she didn't want me to know. These little things began to pile up. For instance, when we talked about family plans or mentioned my uncle, she would quickly change the subject. She used to joke about him, laugh at his quirks, but now, whenever I brought up his name, she would just nod or give short answers, as if she wanted to avoid the discussion. I also started paying attention to her tone during phone calls. It was different, quieter, warmer, but when I walked into the room, it changed immediately. Sometimes she said it was someone from work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a lie. Then came the night when I accidentally saw her messages. I was looking for a charger and noticed her phone left on the couch while she was in the kitchen. A notification popped up on the screen. It was from my uncle. The message contained only a few words. "Thank you for the evening. It was wonderful." My heart sank. I closed the phone without reading further and just sat there, trying to comprehend what it could mean. Am I overreacting? Maybe it's just my imagination, I thought. Maybe it's just a coincidence, and they were discussing something completely innocent. But why had she become so secretive? Why had she changed so much that even I, her husband, started noticing it? Something wasn't right, and I felt like this was only the beginning of something bigger. One day, I came home earlier than planned. Everything seemed normal that day. The sun was shining brightly, birds were singing, and I was in a good mood. I even picked up our favorite dessert to enjoy together. I parked the car and walked into the house, confident that I'd find her in the kitchen or living room as usual. But this time, the house greeted me with an unexpected silence. I placed the bags on the table and followed the faint sound of voices coming from one of the rooms. At first, I thought she might be on the phone, but as I got closer, I realized there were two people in the room. It was my wife's voice and my uncle's. My mind initially refused to interpret this as anything unusual. They often talk, it's nothing bad, I thought, but their tone was different. It was very quiet, almost a whisper. The kind of conversation that makes you hold your breath, trying to catch the context. I cautiously approached the half-open door. My eyes locked on them, and I saw them standing close to each other. Their faces were tense, their voices filled with nervous energy. They didn't notice me at first. Her arms were crossed over her chest, and she looked like she was trying to convince him of something. His head was slightly tilted, his face showing an internal struggle. "You don't understand. It's too risky," I heard her say. Her voice was full of emotion, but she was speaking very softly. "I understand everything, but we have to decide what to do," he replied, also keeping his voice low. My heart tightened. What the hell were they discussing that was so serious? I couldn't hold back any longer. I pushed the door open and stepped into the room, trying to appear as calm as possible, even though inside, I was already overwhelmed with anxiety and suspicion. They both fell silent the moment they noticed me. My uncle took a step back, and my wife looked like she'd been caught in the act. Her eyes widened, and her face turned pale. My uncle, on the other hand, tried to maintain his composure, but I saw him nervously swallow, avoiding my gaze. "What's going on here?" I asked, looking back and forth between them. My voice was steady, but inside, I was barely holding myself together. But inside, a strange unease started to grow. What if I was wrong? And worse, what if I wasn't? Our home had always been a place of ease and comfort. We could talk about anything for hours, laugh at silly things, or just enjoy silence together. But suddenly I noticed something had shifted. It started small, things I initially brushed aside. My wife became more distant. Her focus, once on us and our family, now seemed to drift elsewhere. Take her phone, for example. It used to sit on the table or in another room, but now it was always with her. She carried it everywhere, sometimes even in the pocket of her apron while cooking. This was new. She'd never been so attached to her phone before. In the past, she would check messages openly, even laughing about funny exchanges. But now, things were different. When her phone rang, she'd pick it up and leave the room. One day, I asked, "Who was that?" She replied with her usual nonchalant tone, "Oh, just a friend." But her voice was different. There was a nervousness to it, as though she wanted to quickly move on from the topic. I didn't push her, but the interaction left a bad taste. Why the sudden secrecy over something so ordinary? One evening, I came home early from work. She was sitting on the couch, smiling at her phone. As I walked in, she quickly turned off the screen and set the phone down. I noticed how she straightened up slightly, her tone unnaturally cheerful. "Oh, you're home already? How was your day?" she asked. Her voice sounded forced, almost rehearsed, like she was trying to hide something she didn't want me to see. Little things like this started piling up. For instance, when I brought up family plans or mentioned my uncle, she began to deflect. She used to laugh at his quirks and joke about him, but now, when his name came up, she'd just nod or respond briefly, eager to change the subject. I also noticed a change in her tone during phone calls. It was softer, warmer, but when I entered the room, her demeanor shifted. Sometimes she'd say it was a work call, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. Then came the night when I accidentally saw her messages. I was looking for a charger and noticed her phone left on the couch. A notification popped up. It was from my uncle. The message read, "Thank you for the evening. It was wonderful." My heart stopped. I quickly put the phone down, not daring to read more. I just sat there, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Am I overreacting? Maybe it's nothing, I told myself. Maybe they were talking about something completely innocent. But why the sudden change in her behavior? Why the secrecy? These questions gnawed at me, and deep down, I knew something was off. One day, I came home earlier than usual. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and I was in good spirits. I even picked up dessert, a little treat for us to share. As I walked into the house, I expected to find her in the kitchen or living room like always. But instead, the house greeted me with an unfamiliar silence. I set the bags on the table and followed the faint sound of voices from another room. At first, I thought she might be on the phone, but as I got closer, I realized there were two voices. It was her voice and my uncle's. My initial reaction was to dismiss it as normal. They talk often. It's no big deal, I thought. But their tone was different, quiet, almost whispered. The kind of conversation that makes you hold your breath, trying to catch the meaning. I approached the half-open door cautiously. Through the gap, I saw them standing close to each other, their faces tense, their voices low. They didn't notice me right away. Her arms were crossed, and she looked as though she was trying to convince him of something. His head was slightly tilted, his expression conflicted. "You don't understand. It's too risky." I heard her say, her voice filled with emotion, but barely above a whisper. "I understand, but we have to make a decision," he replied, equally hushed. My heart raced. What could they possibly be talking about that felt this serious? I couldn't hold back any longer. I pushed the door open and stepped in, trying to keep my composure even as my chest tightened with unease and suspicion. They both froze the moment they saw me. My uncle stepped back, and my wife looked like she'd been caught in the act. Her eyes widened, and her face turned pale. My uncle tried to remain calm, but I saw him nervously swallow, avoiding my gaze. "What's going on here?" I asked, my eyes darting between them. My voice was steady, but inside I was barely holding myself together. "Oh, nothing," she quickly replied, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "We were just talking about family matters." "Family matters?" I repeated, my voice laced with doubt. "Yes," my uncle chimed in. His voice was strained, and his eyes still refused to meet mine. "We were just discussing plans for the next holiday. We wanted to plan a surprise for the family." A wave of anger began to rise within me. They both looked so nervous that their words only fueled my suspicions further. Something was clearly wrong. "A surprise?" I said, raising an eyebrow. My gaze shifted between them, and I saw my wife glance quickly at my uncle as if seeking his support. Her hands trembled, though she tried to hide it. The room fell into a tense silence. I stood there, waiting for them to say more, but their faces only reflected unease. It was the first confrontation that made me realize something was deeply wrong in our family. My heart ached with questions. What are you hiding from me? Why are you both acting this way? But at that moment, I received no answers. The next few days were unbearable. The conversation I overheard and my wife's behavior gnawed at me constantly. What did those words mean? What were they hiding? The more I thought about it, the more my suspicions turned into a full-blown nightmare. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't focus, and every little thing felt like confirmation that something was wrong. I knew I couldn't live in this state of uncertainty any longer. I needed answers. And most importantly, I needed proof. One evening, sitting in the living room, I suddenly remembered hidden cameras being sold at tech stores. They were small, easy to conceal, and capable of recording everything in a room. The idea was tempting. It felt like my chance to finally uncover the truth, though just the thought of resorting to such measures made my chest tighten. Was this the right thing to do? Was it too much? But what choice did I have? I can't live in the dark. I thought to myself. If my wife and my uncle were truly hiding something, I had to know. The truth might hurt, but not knowing felt even worse. My hands trembled as I opened my laptop and began researching hidden cameras. There were so many different models, shapes, and features. I chose one of the smallest ones, designed to blend seamlessly into its surroundings. It looked like a standard charging block, perfect for concealing among everyday objects. The next day, I went to the store and bought the camera. I felt a sense of guilt, like I was crossing some invisible line. But at the same time, it seemed like the only way to get the answers I so desperately needed. When I returned home, I began searching for the ideal place to set it up. The living room was the obvious choice. It was where my wife and uncle often spent time together when he visited. I found a spot on the bookshelf, tucked among books and trinkets, where it would be nearly impossible to spot. As I installed the camera, my hands shook so much that I could barely hold it steady. Every step felt like an eternity. I kept glancing over my shoulder, fearing she might walk in and catch me. But the house was quiet, and I managed to finish without interruption. The camera was in place. All that was left now was to wait. The waiting was the hardest part. Every time her phone rang or I saw her texting, a wave of anxiety washed over me. What if my suspicions were wrong? What if I was being unfair to her? But deep down, I knew these doubts weren't just paranoia. Too many small things pointed to something happening behind my back. My mind filled with worst-case scenarios. What if the camera did capture something I dreaded? Could I handle it? Could I cope with the truth? It felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and the next step would determine everything. Over the next few days, I tried to act as normal as possible to avoid raising suspicion. But every time my uncle came over, I felt my nerves tighten. They talked, they laughed, and I sat there silently, knowing the camera was recording every interaction. I will find out the truth, I kept telling myself as I sat on the couch, watching them. But was I truly ready for what I might discover? The following morning, when the house was quiet, I mustered the courage to retrieve the camera. My hands shook as I connected it to my laptop to review the footage. I hoped, desperately, that my intuition had been wrong, that this was all just a product of my imagination, that there was nothing sinister happening. But deep down, I already knew this recording would change everything. The screen lit up, and I began to watch. At first, everything seemed completely normal. On the footage, my wife and uncle sat in the living room. They were drinking coffee, talking, and laughing. Their voices were casual, as they always were, and for a moment, I felt a glimmer of relief. Maybe I really did overthink this, I thought, though my heart continued to race. But then something shifted. Their conversation turned more personal. I heard my uncle ask, "Are you truly happy with him?" My wife laughed, but it was a nervous, strained laugh. She replied, "Sometimes, but other times I feel like something is missing." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe what I was hearing from the woman I considered my partner, my soulmate. But I forced myself to keep watching. On the video, my uncle leaned closer to her. His expression was serious, yet there was something in his eyes that made my chest tighten. It wasn't a friendly or familial look. It was filled with emotions he should have been hiding. "You deserve better," he said. His voice was soft, yet there was a strange warmth in it. My wife didn't respond, but her expression betrayed everything. She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and something I didn't want to name or understand. Their conversation grew more intimate. I watched as he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a casual gesture. His fingers lingered far too long for it to be innocent. And the worst part, she didn't pull away. Instead, she remained there, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They laughed together, their laughter too loud, too close. At one point, I saw her place her hand on his, as though trying to reassure him. It was so natural, so seamless, that my heart clenched with pain. They looked as though they understood each other in a way they never should have. It was almost unbearable to watch. This was no longer just suspicion. This was confirmation of my worst fears. Every second of that recording felt like an eternity. I watched as my uncle leaned slightly closer to her, his hand still resting on her shoulder, and she didn't pull away. Their eyes met, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't my imagination. This wasn't just a close family bond. It was something more, something deeper, and it broke me. I shut the laptop, unable to watch any further. My hands trembled. My heart pounded so violently it felt as if it might burst out of my chest. The images, the moments I had witnessed, were now seared into my mind forever. They confirmed all my worst fears. I sat in silence, trying to process what I had just seen. This wasn't just betrayal. It was something far worse. The people I loved and trusted most were hiding the truth from me. My wife, the person I thought was my soulmate, and my uncle, whom I had always respected and loved like a brother. My reality had shattered, and I realized, after that recording, my life would never be the same again. I couldn't continue living with this weight in my heart. Every time I saw my uncle or my wife, it felt like a fire was consuming me from the inside. The recording I had watched played on a loop in my mind, like a haunting film I couldn't escape. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. I had to hear the truth from him. One evening, while my wife was out, I called my uncle. My voice was calm, but inside, I was a storm. "Can you come over? We need to talk," I said. "Sure, what's this about?" he asked, sounding casual as if nothing had happened. "Important things," I replied curtly, hanging up the phone. When he arrived, we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had once shared countless joyful family dinners. He looked calm, even slightly carefree. His face betrayed no tension, but I already knew what was behind that mask. I started the conversation directly, without any pretense. "What's going on between you and my wife?" I asked. His face tensed for a moment, but he quickly recovered. He tried to laugh, as if I had said something absurd. "What are you talking about?" "Nothing's going on," he said. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. My voice was cold and unyielding. "Don't play games. I know everything. I saw you together." His face went pale. For a moment, he was silent, as if calculating his next move. It's not what you think," he stammered. "Then what is it?" I raised my voice sharply. "You come into my home, spend time with my wife behind my back, and you're telling me it's nothing?" He fell silent. The heavy silence in the room was almost suffocating, as if even the walls were straining to hear our conversation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked me in the eye and said the words I feared most. "It's not what you think, but I'm in love with her." Those words hit me like a lightning bolt. I felt my blood rush to my face. My chest tightened, as though I'd been pierced straight through. My own uncle, a man I had respected, someone I trusted more than most, stood before me admitting he had crossed the line. "In love with her?" I repeated, as if I couldn't comprehend the words. "You're in love with my wife? The woman I love, the woman I protect, the woman I've built a life with." He bowed his head, avoiding my gaze. "It just happened," he mumbled. "I didn't want it to go this far. But I couldn't help it." "Couldn't help it?" I laughed bitterly, the sound dripping with pain and anger. "You're a grown man. You knew exactly what you were doing. You came into my house, sat at my table, looked me in the eye while you secretly betrayed me. And you call it love?" His silence was the only answer I needed. He had nothing to say. His confession tore me apart. I looked at him and no longer saw the uncle I once admired, but a stranger who had betrayed me in the worst way possible. "Do you realize what you've done?" I said, barely containing my fury. You've destroyed everything. How could you? I never meant to hurt you, he replied, but his words were hollow. You already did, I said, and now I don't know how to move forward from this. We sat in silence. His words, his confession, echoed in my mind. In that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. My world had fallen apart, and the person who was supposed to stand by my side had become the one who destroyed it. After my uncle's shocking admission, I knew what had to come next. I needed to confront my wife. But how? How could I look her in the eyes after everything I had seen and heard? How could I try to understand why she had betrayed our trust, our life, our marriage? My mind was a whirlwind of questions, but no answer seemed enough. It was a late evening. She sat in the kitchen scrolling through her phone, seemingly unaware of what I knew. There was no tension in her eyes, but I could feel she was hiding something. I took a deep breath and walked into the room. We need to talk, I said, trying to stay calm, though everything inside me was in turmoil. She looked up, her face confused. What's wrong? She asked, trying to sound casual, but there was a faint trace of anxiety in her voice. I sat across from her, looking her straight in the eye. I know, I said quietly but firmly. Know what? She asked, her tone defensive, her hands nervously gripping her phone. I know about you and my uncle, I said, holding her gaze. I've seen everything. Her face changed instantly. First, she went pale, and then her eyes widened. She tried to smile, as if it were some sort of misunderstanding. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice was too fast, too nervous. Don't you? I whispered. I saw you together. I heard you tell him to be careful. Do you think I'm blind? Her smile vanished. She lowered her head, as if trying to buy time. It's not what you think, she said softly, but she couldn't meet my eyes. Then what is it? My voice rose, and I felt my patience shatter. Explain it to me. How could you do this to me? She lifted her head, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. I don't know how it happened, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You don't know? I repeated, my voice filled with pain and anger. You know exactly what you're doing when you kiss someone. You know exactly what you're doing when you destroy a marriage. How could you betray me like this? She covered her face with her hands and began to cry. I was lonely, she finally said, her voice trembling. You were always busy. You were so distant. And he was just there. So, it's my fault? I asked, barely containing my rage. You're blaming me for you cheating on me with my uncle? No, she quickly denied, wiping tears from her face. It's not your fault. It was a mistake. I never wanted it to go this far. A mistake? I repeated sarcastically. A mistake is when you accidentally drop something. You destroyed our marriage, our trust. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. She cried harder this time, her sobs filling the room. I love you, she said through her tears. I know I did something terrible, but I want to fix this. I want us to start over. Please give me a chance. Her words sounded like a desperate plea, but they didn't elicit any sympathy from me. They only deepened the pain I already felt. How can I ever trust you again? I asked, staring into her tear-streaked eyes. How can you talk about love when you were betraying me behind my back? It was never supposed to happen, she said, clinging to her words as if they could absolve her. But it didn't mean anything. It was just what? I yelled, feeling tears of anger well up in my eyes. You're saying it didn't mean anything, but every time you let it continue, you destroyed our life together. This isn't just a mistake. It's betrayal. She lowered her head, sobbing, but I couldn't listen anymore. My feelings for her had become a tangled mess. Love that now felt like a faint shadow, anger that burned in every word, and a deep emptiness that consumed my heart. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, I said, standing up from the table. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything we built together. She looked up at me, but I was no longer looking at her. I walked out of the room, leaving her in silence, with her tears and her words, which could no longer change anything. I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, staring at my reflection. The man looking back at me was not the same man I had been months ago. My gaze was full of pain, my shoulders felt heavier than ever, and my soul was still consumed by emptiness. But at the same time, I saw someone who had walked through hell and was still standing. Yes, the betrayal had broken me, but it hadn't completely destroyed me. Those days, when I uncovered the horrifying truth, left an indelible mark. I remember every moment, setting up the hidden camera, watching my world crumble after seeing the recording, looking into the eyes of the person I once called my soulmate, and hearing her justify the unjustifiable. It was a time when my heart felt shattered into 1,000 pieces, and trust was erased as if it had never existed. I knew the decision was inevitable. I could stay in this chaos, hoping that something might change, or I could do the hardest thing, pull myself out of this pain, this destructive place, and start anew. I realized this wasn't just a decision. It was my chance to break free from the trap I had been thrown into by the people I trusted the most. The betrayal not only shattered our marriage, but forced me to rethink my entire life. I could no longer be the man who blindly trusted, who believed everything would always be perfect. This experience taught me that even those closest to you can cause you pain, but it shouldn't stop you from moving forward. I sat in the same living room where I once laughed with my wife and family, and for the first time in a long while, I asked myself, what's next? My life had fallen apart, but I refused to let this be my end. I decided that from this moment on, I would move forward, not backward, not remain stuck, but forward. The first step was to change my environment. I started with the house. I got rid of every item that reminded me of the betrayal. Photos, gifts, even furniture. These things were symbols of a past I no longer wanted to carry with me. The home that once felt so warm and comforting had become a place haunted by memories of the past. So I turned it into something new. New walls, new colors, new furniture. It was my way of starting fresh. The next step was reclaiming control over my life. I began focusing on my health, both physical and emotional. I sought therapy, and it turned out to be one of the most important decisions of my life. At first, I couldn't even talk about what had happened. But slowly, I learned that speaking about it and working on myself were keys to healing. Most importantly, this experience taught me about my own strength. I realized that my worth isn't determined by how others treat me. I deserve more. I deserve happiness, even if it means creating it on my own. Now, as I share this story with you, I want to tell you something important. Betrayal is one of the worst things that can happen to you. It strikes at your heart, your soul, and your trust in the world. It makes you doubt everything, including yourself, but it can also become your greatest lesson. I've learned that you cannot let betrayal define your life. You might lose faith in people, but don't lose faith in yourself. You might fall, but you can always get back up. You might lose a piece of your heart, but that doesn't mean you'll lose your entire future. Today, I look at my life as a new chapter. The journey has been hard, but it has made me stronger, wiser, and more confident. Yes, the pain lingers. The scars never fully fade. But those scars are not weaknesses. They are reminders that I survived. So, if you're listening to this story and feel like your life is falling apart, remember, this is not the end. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. You deserve happiness, even after the darkest of times. And your future is what you choose to create.